right. Welcome to another deep dive. We're tackling, I guess you could call them thinker profiles this time around. We've got a really fascinating one today.
Yeah, definitely. Should be a fun one.
For our listeners who are always pushing the boundaries of knowledge, those of y'all who really want to get down to the nitty-gritty, well, today we're going deep on René Descartes. That name that keeps popping up in philosophy, and for good reason.
Absolutely.
We're using, let me see. Yeah. The Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy's entry on Descartes.
Excellent source. Really comprehensive.
It is incredibly detailed. And the mission, well, is to really unpack who Descartes was. Not just the philosopher, but the mathematician, the scientist. The guy had his hands in a lot of intellectual pies, so to speak.
I think what we want to get across is that this isn't just some historical figure. His ideas, they're still alive, still sparking debate, even centuries later, especially for people like our listeners, people who think deeply about these things.
Okay, so where do we even begin with a guy like Descartes? Well, the entry points out that his journey was kind of a progression, right? He started as a mathematician, then shifted to natural science and philosophy, and then finally landed on metaphysics. It's like he kept digging deeper, uncovering layer after layer.
Yeah, exactly. It's like an archaeological dig into the nature of reality. And what's so cool is at every stage, he made some serious contributions. Take math, for example. He didn't just come up with new techniques, he actually revolutionized how we approach spatial problems.
Oh, you mean like with algebraic geometry?
Precisely. Analytic geometry. He found this way to bridge algebra and geometry, which, let me tell you, back then, those were seen as totally separate.
But he showed how you could use equations to describe geometric shapes.
So basically, he gave us a new language to talk about space.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that's where Cartesian coordinates come in. That grid system we use everywhere, physics, engineering, computer graphics, even mapping.
Oh yeah, that x-axis and u-axis thing. Yeah, that's pure Descartes. And it's not just some abstract mathematical tool. Think about it. It literally changed how we visualize and measure the world.
I guess I never really thought about it like that. And then, of course, there's the whole natural philosophy side, or, science as we call it now. He wasn't just an armchair theorist. He was out there making discoveries.
Oh, yeah, big time. He actually figured out the sine law of refraction, which is a huge deal in optics. And get this, he even developed a pretty accurate theory about how rainbows form. I mean, we take it for granted now, but that was cutting-edge stuff back then.
So he's combining this mathematical rigor with actual observations of the natural world.
Exactly. That's one of the things that makes him so unique. He was always pushing the boundaries of both. And it wasn't just optics and rainbows. He even had some ideas about how the Earth and the planets formed.
Oh, yeah, like a sort of precursor to the nebular hypothesis.
Yeah.
So way ahead of his time, considering most people still clung to the idea of divine creation. I mean, suggesting that these celestial bodies just kind of, coalesce from a bunch of scattered matter was pretty revolutionary.
Yeah, it was a huge shift in thinking, from a universe governed by a divine will to one governed by natural processes, these laws that are kind of universal.
And his view of science in general was pretty groundbreaking too, right? Like the idea that the natural world operates according to fundamental properties of matter and these universal laws.
That was massive, especially because the dominant view back then, the Aristotelian one, was all about inherent purposes and qualities.
Oh, yeah, like the idea that a rock falls to the ground because it's in its nature to seek its natural place, the center of the universe.
Exactly. Descartes said, nope, it's not about purpose. It's about these physical laws that govern how matter behaves.
And, of course, we can't forget the whole mind-body problem, right? I mean, that's one of the biggest questions in philosophy. And it was Descartes who really put it on the map.
Yeah, totally. It's a direct consequence of his mechanistic view of the world. If everything in the physical world is determined by these laws, then where does the mind fit in? Where does free will come in?
Right. If the brain is just a machine, then how can we possibly have thoughts, feelings, and consciousness? It's a doozy of a problem, and it's still debated today.
Big time. Now, a mind like Descartes, it's no surprise that he wrote a lot. I mean, the entry lists all his major works, and it's pretty impressive. We've got Discourse on the Method, which kind of outlines his approach to knowledge and includes essays on optics, meteorology, and, you guessed it, his geometry.
Then there's Meditations on First Philosophy, deep dive into metaphysics.
Yep, that's the one where he lays out his famous "I think, therefore I am" argument.
And let's not forget Principles of Philosophy, which is like his grand attempt at a system of both metaphysics and natural philosophy.
That's the big one. And then there's Passions of the Soul, which is all about emotions, trying to figure out how those work in this whole mind-body framework.
Quite the collection. And even after his death, there were more works, like World and Treatise on Man, and of course, Rules for the Direction of the Mind, which he never actually finished.
Yeah, that's a shame. But even the unfinished stuff gives us valuable insight into how his thinking evolved.
So what's really fascinating is that Descartes' work has been interpreted in so many different ways throughout history. In his time, he was hailed as this brilliant mathematician and the architect of a new physics.
Oh, yeah, he was a rock star. But then later on, people started focusing on different aspects of his thought. Like in the 19th century, there was a lot of interest in his mechanistic physiology.
And then in the 20th century, the cogito that I think, therefore I am thing really took center stage.
It's like each generation finds something different to grab onto in his work, and that just goes to show how rich and complex his ideas were. But there have been some pretty contrasting views on him too. Some see him as this hero who paved the way for modern science and philosophy. Others see him as a villain, especially with that whole mind-body dualism thing.
Yeah, there's definitely a lot to unpack there. So let's go back to the beginning. What kind of influences shaped his thinking? The deep dive mentions his education at the Jesuit College of La Flèche. Seems like a pretty intense place for a young mind.
Oh, it was. He got a solid grounding in the classics there. Aristotle, the ancient atomists, Plato, the Stoics, even skepticism. And this was during a time when, new scientific discoveries like Galileo's were shaking things up. Talk about intellectual ferment.
So he's exposed to all these different ideas, these different ways of thinking. But the entry mentions that he became increasingly dissatisfied with his education.
Yeah, classic Descartes. He just wasn't satisfied with the answers he was getting. He felt like despite all this learning, he was actually more aware of what he didn't know.
It's like that saying, the more you learn, the more you realize how much you don't know.
Exactly. And for Descartes, this was especially true in philosophy. He was frustrated by all the disagreements, all the conflicting viewpoints.
Well, philosophy is all about asking those tough questions, isn't it?
Absolutely. But for Descartes, it wasn't enough to just ask the questions. He wanted answers. He wanted certainty.
So he didn't just reject everything he'd learned, right? He still valued things like languages, logic, even theology.
Oh, for sure. He wasn't throwing the baby out with the bathwater. It was more like he was seeing these cracks in the foundation, And he knew that if the foundation wasn't solid, the whole intellectual structure was in trouble.
So it was kind of this deep dissatisfaction that fueled his quest for knowledge.
Totally. Now, after his formal education, his path was a bit, well, unconventional. He got a law degree, but never practiced. He even spent some time as a gentleman's soldier.
A soldier philosopher. That's an interesting combination.
It is, right. But that's where things get really interesting. During his military service, he met this guy, Isaac Beeckman, a Dutch mathematician and natural philosopher. And those two, they hit it off.
Yeah, the entry talks about their intense collaboration, their exploration of physico-mathematica, basically applying math to the study of the natural world, right?
Yep. They were both fascinated by the idea that you could use math to unlock the secrets of the universe. And get this, they even dabbled in atomism, the idea that matter is made up of these tiny, indivisible particles.
Oh, yeah. Descartes even kept a notebook titled Democritica as a tribute to Democritus, the ancient atomist.
It seems like his time with Beeckman was super influential. It really pushed him to combine math and physics in his thinking.
And it was around this time that he had his big breakthrough with analytic geometry. But it's interesting, the entry points out that initially he didn't see it as a replacement for traditional geometry, but rather as an extension.
Yeah, he was kind of building on what was already there. It took some time for Cartesian coordinates to become the standard framework we know today.
And then there are those famous dreams he had on November 10th, 1619. Talk about a turning point.
Oh, yeah, those dreams were huge. It's like he had this divine inspiration, this mission to reform all knowledge, starting with philosophy.
Talk about dramatic. So by the late 1620s, he's got this mission, this groundbreaking mathematical tool, and a deep understanding of the philosophical landscape.
Exactly. And that's where what the entry calls his metaphysical turn really kicks in.
Okay, so he moves to the Netherlands in 1628 and dives headfirst into mathematics and metaphysics. But then he gets sidetracked by this weird phenomena.
Oh, yeah, the parhelia, these false suns that were observed near Rome. Descartes, ever the scientist, wanted to figure out how to explain them.
So he put his metaphysical inquiries on hold to try to figure out this atmospheric optical illusion.
But it's not really a sidetrack, it's more like a detour that still takes him in the same direction. Mm. He believed that figuring out the nature of God and the human self was essential for understanding physics.
It's like he was trying to build this really solid foundation before he could confidently construct the rest of the building.
Exactly. And while he was working on this Parhelia problem, his ambition to explain the natural world crystallized into a plan for this massive treatise called The World.
The world. Sounds ambitious.
It was. He wanted to explain everything light, man, the soul. It was supposed to be a three-part work, but unfortunately, only the sections on light and man survive.
Oh, yeah, because of Galileo, right?
Yeah. Descartes got wind that Galileo was getting condemned for his heliocentric views, and he decided it was best to keep the world under wraps. He didn't want to risk the same fate.
Makes sense. So in the world, he lays out this vision of the universe as basically just matter in motion. No inherent purposes or qualities, just particles interacting according to these physical laws.
It was a pretty radical departure from the Aristotelian view. But instead of releasing the world as planned, he opted for a more cautious approach. He published Discourse on the Method anonymously in 1637, along with those essays on optics and meteorology.
Discourse on the Method is a fascinating read. It's kind of autobiographical, and it introduces some of his key ideas like mind-body dualism. But it's definitely less radical than the world.
Yeah, he intentionally toned down the skepticism, probably because he was writing in French for a wider audience.
Yeah, and it's interesting. In the Discourse, his claim about the essence of matter being extension is presented more as a hypothesis than a definite truth.
He's being strategic there. He knows he hasn't fully laid out his metaphysical case yet, so he's kind of testing the waters.
Okay, so then we get to meteorology, where he proposes this hypothesis about the nature of matter. He's saying it's made up of these tiny parts of various shapes and sizes, with this subtle matter in between them that transmits light.
Sounds like a precursor to corpuscularianism.
It is. He's basically saying, forget about atoms and void. There's just this one type of matter that's infinitely divisible. And this is where he really breaks with Aristotle, rejecting the idea of substantial forms and real qualities.
Yeah, he's saying we don't need those concepts to explain the world. We can do it all with matter in motion.
So instead of saying that a knife is sharp because it possesses some inherent sharpness, he's saying that sharpness is simply a result of the physical shape and arrangement of the matter.
Exactly. He's providing a purely mechanistic explanation. And it's the same with color. He's saying that color isn't a property inherent to an object. It's a result of how light particles interact with the surface of the object and how that affects our senses.
So redness isn't really out there in the world. It's a product of our perception.
Precisely. Now, in The World in Meteorology, Descartes is a bit cautious about how he talks about substantial forms and real qualities.
Yeah, the entry points out that this is probably because he hadn't fully developed his metaphysics yet and he didn't want to rock the boat too much.
Makes sense. After all, the Aristotelian view was still pretty dominant. But, even with this cautious approach, he still faced pushback. People had questions about his rejection of substantial forms, his mind-body dualism, and his methods for proving his hypotheses.
And his responses are pretty interesting. Like, he says that he left out the really hardcore skepticism from the discourse because he didn't want to overwhelm his audience, especially the women.
Yeah, he was definitely a strategic thinker, always considering his audience. And in the midst of all this intellectual back and forth, he also experienced a personal tragedy, the death of his daughter, Francine.
Yeah, that must have been incredibly difficult. It's a reminder that even these great thinkers are human. They experience the same joys and sorrows as the rest of us.
Absolutely. So let's move on to the next big phase, the full unveiling of Descartes' metaphysics and his complete system of physics.
This is where Meditations on First Philosophy comes in, right?
Yeah.
He started working on that in 1639.
Exactly. And he really wanted to get it right. He even planned to send it to a bunch of theologians and philosophers beforehand to get their feedback. Always up for a good debate.
Yeah, that's how we got those 7 sets of objections and replies that were published with the Meditations. Some serious thinkers weighed in: Catullus, Bourdain, Gassendi, Hobbes, Arnauld. It was like a who's who of 17th century intellectual heavyweights.
It really shows how seriously Descartes took the idea of philosophical dialogue. He wasn't afraid to put his ideas out there and defend them.
And even though the Meditations is mostly about metaphysical questions, Descartes himself considered it to be the foundation for his physics.
Yeah, it lays out the groundwork for his understanding of matter, God, the mind, and the relationship between them. Those are all key to his physics.
So having established his metaphysical foundation, he was ready to present his full-fledged physics to the world.
And he wanted to make sure it reached the right audience. So he published Principles of Philosophy in Latin in 1644. This was his magnum opus, his attempt to systematize all of his scientific and philosophical ideas.
And a couple years later, in 1647, he released a French translation, probably to reach a wider audience. He even included a special author's letter in the French edition, emphasizing the importance of independent thinking in philosophy.
Classic Descartes, always challenging people to think for themselves. And then there's that famous tree of philosophy analogy, right? Metaphysics as the roots, physics as the trunk, and all the other sciences as the branches.
Yeah, it's a great visual for how he saw knowledge as this interconnected system.
Mm.
Now, the principles are divided into four parts. The first part lays out his metaphysical principles, the second covers his physics, the third deals with astronomy, and the fourth tackles things like the formation of the earth, minerals, and the senses.
He had originally planned to cover even more topics, plants, animals, human physiology, the whole 9 yards, but he ended up having to cut some things short.
So despite all his efforts to stay out of theological hot water, Descartes did end up getting caught up in some controversy.
Yeah, unfortunately. He had always been careful to separate his philosophical claims from religious dogma. He even said that his conception of God was more deistic than anything else.
But those careful distinctions didn't stop the theologians from coming after him.
Nope. He had some issues with the Jesuits stemming from those objections from Bourdain. And then he got into a major fight with the Calvinist theologians in the Netherlands, especially those guys at Utrecht University, Voetius and Regis.
Yeah, they actually condemned his philosophy. Talk about a blow.
It was, but Descartes didn't back down. He fired back with those publications of his letter to Voetius, comments on a certain broadsheet, and Querela Apologetica.
So even though he was trying to keep philosophy and theology separate, he ended up right in the middle of the theological brawl. Shows how even abstract ideas can have real-world consequences.
For sure. Now, through all this drama, Descartes was still plugging away at his work on physiology. He wrote Treatise on Man and Description of the Human Body during this period.
And he also had that fascinating correspondence with Princess Elizabeth of Bohemia.
Oh yeah, their letters are great. They cover all sorts of topics, from metaphysics to the passions. And it seems like Elizabeth really pushed him to clarify some of his ideas.
Yeah, and that correspondence actually led to his final major work, Passions of the Soul. That's where he presents his complete theory of emotions.
His last hurrah, so to speak. So in his final years, Descartes received an intriguing invitation from Queen Christina of Sweden.
Yeah, she was interested in his philosophy and wanted him to come tutor her.
Yeah,
And he accepted, right? He even helped draft the statutes for the Swedish Royal Academy.
he did. But unfortunately, things took a turn for the worse. He got sick shortly after arriving in Sweden, and he died on February 11th, 1650.
What a life. A true intellectual giant.
Absolutely, and his influence is still felt today.
So let's wrap things up. We've seen how René Descartes was this incredible polymath, a master of math, science, and philosophy.
His contributions were huge. Analytic geometry, mechanistic physics, mind-body dualism, those are just a few of the biggies.
He really changed the way we think about the world, about ourselves, about the nature of knowledge itself.
And his ideas continue to be debated and discussed by philosophers today. He was a true pioneer, and his legacy lives on.
And that brings us to our final thought for you, our listeners. Considering Descartes' focus on reason and his wrestling with the mind-body problem, a topic that continues to fascinate philosophers, how do you see his ideas shaping current discussions in philosophy of mind? It's something to ponder as you continue your own deep dives into these complex and fascinating questions.
I think he'd be pleased that we're still grappling with them, still pushing the boundaries of what we know. It's a testament to the enduring power of his thought.
So keep those minds churning, listeners, and we'll see you on our next deep dive.